On North Korea, and there's plenty latest.
The Dan Yorke State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
It's hard to figure out where we're actually going with this North Korean thing. I think anybody who didn't think there'd be some roller coaster and turbulence, you know, en route to this June 12th target date for a summit with North Korea, if you weren't thinking there would be turbulence, you probably weren't paying a lot of attention or, you know, looking at it with any level of common sense. So I don't know that we need to throw up over the idea that it's been a little bit on and off, on and off, on and off. I just don't know where it is. And my guest tonight has been our kind of go-to guy in North Korea, and I'm not sure he knows where it's going because I don't think the parties actually know where it's going. But what the latest is, and what it all means to us as we roll through the program this evening. Nice to have you. Thanks for tuning in. The school situation, though, is kind of tough right now. You know, after Texas, we get a headline like this in Taunton, and the latest from Eyewitness News.
We take any threat to any school or any building in our community very, very seriously.
Taunton Police Lieutenant Eric Nichols briefing reporters in front of the empty Taunton High School, closed today along with the adjacent middle school after a threatening note was found.
The threat had today's date on it, and that was part of the decision, and that additionally we needed investigative time to determine whether that threat was credible or not. Right. And that's still an ongoing investigation.
Nichols declined to say what specifically the note writer was threatening to do. He said police are still investigating who wrote it and whether it was credible. Threatening a school can carry jail time and fines under Massachusetts law.
So even something as minor that causes an evacuation in a day, a person that makes that threat could be charged with that felony.
School is scheduled to be open Wednesday. Taunton parent Christine Michelli showed up to the news conference to hear what police had to say. She said she won't be convinced the school is safe until someone is arrested.
I'm very scared, very scared. But I like, if I also hold my children home for the rest of the school year, I can be in trouble as a parent, but I need them to prove to me that my children are safe. All the children are safe.
You can't. That's the, I mean, look, the chances are 99.9999999% that the school is safe. The chances of something happening in Santa Fe or Parkland here are as good as they were there. Nobody can get complete reassurance, but one must move on. You know, our response to terrorism is, has been historically, just carry on. The same thing here. Although, I mean, there's certain things that you have to be careful about. And in part, certainly when the Taunton authorities seem to have this thing under control, somewhere along the line you just have to trust that they know what they're doing. In North Smithfield today, this just came to us just prior to the taping. We taped the program in the early afternoon. The superintendent of schools sent out a message to North Smithfield families that reads like this. Yesterday at the high school there was an incident during an argument. One student threatened to bring a gun to school and shoot another student. Our job is not to interpret teenage bluster, but to respond quickly and decisively to any perceived compromise to student safety. The school administration immediately contacted the police, and officers were on the scene and began an investigation. Our students were not in danger. However, with the Florida and Texas shooting, and it goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on, to do all the right things and say all the right things about protocol, safety, and all of that. I think the conversations here are about conflict resolution in a lot of ways. You know, if one kid's getting bullied and decides to go from 0 to 60 in 2.8 seconds and say, you know what, I'm just going to shoot you. That's one of our big problems now. I mean, school systems can't not respond to a kid making that kind of an allegation. That would be wholly irresponsible, right? But in the old days, you know, when men were men and sheep were sheep, and we all walked uphill both ways to school in 4 feet of snow and liked it, barefoot, by the way, you know, when we were all growing up. We did, even if we were the kid getting picked on, we didn't resolve to a threat of shooting. We've done a terrible job in interpersonal relationships. We've done a terrible job in conflict resolution. And amongst the things that we need to talk about in the school safety thing are, resource officers, metal detectors, Yeah, surveillance cameras. How about how to deal with one another? How about conflict resolution? How about talking about not going from 0 to 60, one way or the other? So anyway, I think that's where society's going to have to change and kind of go backwards, which I think would be going forwards. Anyway, well, we got to do some more programming on this. And on the radio, of course, we talk about this on a regular basis, weekdays 3 to 6 on WPRO. Let's get to the North Korea thing. And my esteemed guest, Professor Roehrig from the U.S. Naval War College. Here are a couple of headlines on progress here. So North Korea reportedly is starting to dismantle a test site that would be for what? Future nuclear weaponry. And high approval ratings for the president of South Korea. It all adds up to this latest report that was put together midday by CBS.
South Korean President Moon Jae-in is at the White House today in an attempt to keep the North Korean summit with the U.S. on track.
Is this summit with North Korea on June 12th going to happen?
Well, as the president often says, Martha, we'll see.
North Korea raised the prospect of canceling the summit over objections to joint U.S.-South Korean military exercises and remarks made by the National Security Advisor John Bolton when he compared Trump's plan to the Libya model.
I think we're looking at the Libya model of 2003, 2004. We're also looking at what North Korea itself has committed to previously.
Libya's government collapsed 8 years later after giving up its nuclear weapons, and leader Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown. North Korean state media issued a statement today saying dialogue and saber rattling can never go together and will chill the atmosphere before the planned U.S.-North Korean summit. The White House says President Trump is still committed to holding that summit on June 12th, but will walk away if North Korea isn't ready to completely abandon its nuclear program.
What the president's made clear is that we need complete and verifiable and irreversible denuclearization.
The U.S. plans to keep up all economic and military pressure on Pyongyang. Just today, the USS Milius, an advanced guided missile destroyer, arrived in Japan to protect against any ballistic missile attacks by North Korea.
Why do I think this is a farce? This notion that, first of all, welcome. Professor Roehrig is now a regular guest, so I jump right into it. And speaks for himself, not the Naval War College. We always make that disclaimer. When Kim Jong-un sounds like the guy who's trying to send rational messages precursor to this meeting, and when we are laying down the law that a promise of complete denuclearization is a prerequisite to the meeting, I keep thinking that none of this makes sense.
Well, it's not a farce, but it is certainly a process and a set of goals that we have a long way to go to get these matched up. I think on two levels. First of all, just even the goal, denuclearization. We have been talking a lot over the last number of months whether we have the same definition of denuclearization as the North Koreans.
Right.
But I have always thought that it is important to have this dialogue to find out, to see what the North Koreans are willing to do, where there might be some middle ground to be able to get to. But then the second part is the process. Even if you can agree to some sort of goal, what you're seeing playing out in this whole Libya story is some disagreement in the administration, where President Trump, I think, is perhaps a bit more optimistic, but you have others like Bolton and Vice President Pence who are suggesting along the lines of this Libya model that any North Korean concessions have to be front-loaded, and that we are going to expect North Korea to give up a lot at the front end. And why would we expect North Korea to do that? They don't trust us any more than we trust them. Even if you can get to a point where denuclearization is possible, front-loading all of this is going to be difficult, and it's going to require some U.S. concessions that it's not clear we are willing to make at this particular point.
I mean, they're asking for a front loading of what would be the ultimate resolution to talks and the long process within those talks. I mean, they're asking for the end. It's like having a family disagreement or a divorcing couple or whatever. You're saying, you know what? We just got to agree that we love each other. Okay, now we'll work on it. It's like you just got to agree that you're going to give up all your nuclear weapons. And then we'll go to a summit and we'll talk about it. I mean, listen, I'm no diplomat and I've got no experience in state, but that doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, we often look at negotiations and agreements and arrive at the conclusion that a good agreement is one where we get everything we want. That's not a negotiation.
Everyone knows that.
And so where is it possible for the United States to give something in return for North Korea moving towards denuclearization? And I think anyone who thinks that this is going to be a quick, simple process is really fooling themselves. And this is something that those of us who've been following North Korea for many years have understood, that this is not going to happen in a simple process where North Korea simply gives up its nuclear weapons.
All right, well, I think
if it will even do that at all.
Sure, I think we need to talk about motive on the part of both parties, and we'll come back with the professor. In the meantime, let me just remind you that if you're looking to help with your finances, in the palm of your hand, the Card Valet app from Navigant Credit Union would be a perfect way to do that. Just sign up for an account at any one of the 18 branches across Rhode Island of the Navigant Credit Union, now a statewide credit union, and go online at navigantcu.org and learn all about it. Remember, NCUA, Navigant Credit Union. Enjoy life's journey. Right back with Professor Roehrig. Stay with us.
I don't think the president gets cold feet about anything. So I think, as the president has said, right now it's still on.
Yeah, I always find it interesting when the Treasury Secretary is making commentary on a North Korean summit. Not that there isn't economic aspects to this, right? It's not just about missiles. But the bench doesn't seem very deep to me, to the White House, in the White House, in terms of strategy. And John Bolton in now as security advisor, speaking, as you aptly, I think, pointed out, more or less on the same or close to the same page as Vice President. And the President doesn't seem either to be connected or caring about how they're putting this whole thing together. He just to say, listen, we're going to try to get together. If we don't, okay. I'm not sure what the motive here is. What's the motive on our part? And then we'll talk about what the motive is in North Korea. Because you've given us some, and you should go back to some of the website archives of our conversations in the past, where Terry has done a good job of talking about motive in North Korea and culture and what they really want. We'll check in on that. What's our motive here? What are we trying to do? Do we know?
Well, sure. I mean, I think our motive has been very clear. It is about, it's that acronym CVIT, complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. But the question is whether that is a goal that can be achieved. I am very skeptical that North Korea is willing to give up its nuclear weapons.
Because?
Because I think they see it as a fundamental element of their national security. It protects them from any sort of regime change operation, something that is reinforced when you hear all this discussion about the Libya model, because that's exactly
Gaddafi gave it up, and
their
nightmare, right?
If you will. And so I think, from our perspective, that's our goal. But I think it's unlikely that the North Koreans will be willing to do that. So then, what are we left with? We have to try to explore what possibilities there are that can improve the security situation, that can make North Korea less of a threat. Though again, it is unlikely that that's going to include denuclearization. I think the most apt way to describe this, and something that I've been saying for a number of years, is that this may not be a problem that we can solve. Not all problems in international relations can be solved. Instead, it's going to have to be a problem that we can manage. And I'm optimistic that we can do that North Korea can be contained and deterred. But it is likely going to mean a continued nuclear North Korea.
Is managed solved?
I don't. Well, in the sense,
right? I mean, you sound very reasonable. Well, it can't be solved, but it can be managed. Well, I think for American citizens, managed is solved.
Well, it depends on, again, how you define the problem. If the problem is a nuclear North Korea, the solution is denuclearization. But again, I think that as a solution is very unlikely. So then it's how do you manage that?
So managing it would be no new nukes. And maybe this test site dismantling footage is at least a flare from Kim Jong-un to say, yeah, we get it. You know, some of the stuff we got going forward, we're going to kind of temper what we're doing, but we're not going to give away, you know, we're not going to not have a parade anymore, you know, with all those weapons running down the street, because that's part of our chin out culture that we're developing here. I would think the world would see a slowdown or stoppage of further nuclearization of North Korea to be managing the situation, right?
Well, and I think that is one of the potential interim goals. Kim Jong-un has said, first as the talks were beginning to ramp up, that he would not conduct any more testing during dialogue, and then he made a more formal commitment during the South Korean talks. He has said he's done all the testing that he needs. He's got a complete program and doesn't need to do any more. Some question about whether that's necessarily the case, but nonetheless, that would be something. I think another element would be some sort of termination of the armistice, which is simply a ceasefire in place since the Korean War, and replace that with a formal peace treaty. I think that would be a positive step.
Between what parties?
Well, that gets a little complicated because technically the signers of the armistice were, at least formally, the United States, the United States, North Korea, and China. South Korea did not sign the armistice, but I think that would all be sort of legal minutia that could be solved relatively easily. But it would have to be something most likely coming out of some sort of a six-party process that would certainly include the two Koreas, China and the United States, but also probably Russia and Japan.
What is North Korea's motive right now? What is their motive?
Well, I think that's unclear, and that's why the talks are so important, is to explore what those motives are. But again, I come back to, I think it's unlikely that they are willing to give up their nuclear weapons unless, I mean, they speak about denuclearization as denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
Everybody.
So what does that mean exactly? And certainly there are interpretations that mean an end to the alliance, we're gone,
right.
The ending of the U.S. nuclear umbrella. Those things would be non-starters from an alliance perspective. But surprisingly, Kim also said a few weeks ago that he understands that the presence of U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula is likely to remain.
So why did this exercise? Why did this exercise really bother him, or is he just busting chops?
Well, it's not entirely clear about that either. Now, he had also made a statement that he understood that exercises needed to continue to go forward, but what he seemed to indicate this time was he had some problem with the fact that there were B-52 bombers, which are nuclear capable, that were part of these exercises. But again, it's not entirely clear whether, as you point out, this is just busting our chops, or whether this is truly something that North Korea objects to. Again, you know, there's a whole spectrum of assessments of this, that on the one hand, these are legitimate objections that North Korea has, and we need to address those, versus it's just North Korean behavior all over again, and how sincere are they really to sit at the table?
And the question in the next segment is, how sincere is this White House and this president of really getting something done, or just looking like something's getting done? I'll be right back.
So I want to thank you all. It's very early in the morning. I think you probably broke the all-time in history television rating for 3 o'clock in the morning, that I would say. But I want to just congratulate. These are 3 great people, and congratulations.
What do you think his motive is?
Oh, I think he
just to keep the conversation going and looking like he's getting something done, or really we're working hard enough to create a true legacy, which is that this would be historic and changes the world.
Sure. I mean, I think his motive is to truly bring an end to this problem. I think he sees that he is invested in this. I think that, though there is debate about this as well, that feels that his policy of maximum pressure has been useful in bringing North Korea to the table. We certainly are well aware of his belief in his deal-making abilities, and believes that he may have a chance to do this, to bring some conclusion to this. I don't think his advisors, particularly, again, as we mentioned, the Vice President and National Security Advisor, are as convinced as he is that this can come to a fruitful conclusion. But I think he is truly believing that he may be able to get North Korea to be willing to give up its nuclear weapons.
Do you think he's smart enough to do it? I mean, this notion of the art of the deal and this, I mean, you go back and take a look at the last 18 months, I'm not sure that he's singularly responsible for cracking any deals, to be honest with you. It's a whole big, you know, hype job, seems to me. I mean, you got to know what your end goal and what the reasonable expectation is, and you have to be a real student of the situation.
Yeah, well, and
especially if you're running by yourself, and your other guys are kind of like, I don't know what he's doing.
Sure. Well, and I think, you know, your point about the realistic goals, I think, is key here. What is realistic? What can we hope to achieve from North Korea? The North Koreans are certainly going to come in prepared, and from comments by Secretary Pompeo, by President Moon, that they were impressed with Kim Jong-un's understanding of the issues, his preparation, etc. Our side needs to be equally prepared, and I hope that we are.
All right. So do you think
to the task.
Do you think June 12th? We only have a minute. Does June 12th happen? I mean, it's, you know, on again, off again, on again, off again. I mean, it may change over the course of the news cycle between today's press conference with the South Korean president, our president, and now. I mean, it just. Do you think it will happen on June 12th?
Well, thinking of this in terms of Vegas odds, I think the odds have probably dropped a little that it may not happen on the 12th. But I think it's still likely that it probably will, but I think there's also perhaps a possibility it may be postponed. How long, I don't know, but it will depend on how these next few weeks play out. But I think what you have seen over the last few weeks is a lot of negotiation and sort of jockeying on the U.S. part, on the North Korean part, the South Koreans intervening, trying to help this move forward. But we'll see.
We'll see. All right. Well, you know, we'll bring the professor back when something develops, June 12th or later. Thank you, kid. Appreciate it. Final word, and we come back. So tomorrow we will come back home and discuss how we field our fire departments, what the platoon system is in most of our communities and what it should be, with an emphasis on an analysis on what's going on in Warwick with Ken Block, government watchdog, and Warwick double secret watchdog, Rob Cody. So join us tomorrow evening. I'll see you on the radio at 3 tomorrow on WPRL. Thanks for watching. Good night.